Very rarely nowadays does a game come along that not only challenges the ways in which genres of video games can be perceived, but also the subject matter the games in that genre can cover and the ways in which they are depicted. The racing game genre, as an example, would primarily be arcade focused until games like Gran Turismo started to add a simulated edge to it. Action games in general too changed when games such as Lara Croft Tomb Raider and Max Payne showed up on the scene. Lots of games have released over the years to change the ways in which genres of games can be received, even to a point of creating genres in and of themselves. The survival horror genre is a standout example of this, where you can see the genre in its early days look notably cartoonish in terms of its violence, much like the Hammer horror films that it tended to be based on, or at the very least inspired by. Things started to get scary with the release of Alone in the Dark in 1992, and Capcom soon joined the fray with the release of Resident Evil in 1996, taking what Alone in the Dark established and adding its own spin on it with a touch of Japanese weirdness. The next quantum leap in horror games, however, would take the schlocky and cartoonish yet unsettling vibes from those games, tone them down a little, and inject some discord and chaos with what would become something of a pinnacle example of what the horror genre could do for over 2 decades. Allow me to take you on a trip to the town of Silent Hill. Silent Hill is a psychological survival horror game released in 1999 for the PlayStation, published by Konami and developed by a ragtag group of developers within Konami who, at the time, were seen by Konami executives as having underperformed in their work. To whip them into shape, Konami came up with the idea of cashing in on the schlocky horror renaissance that was well underway by then, and gave the team a brief that would suitably cash in on that market. Difficulties brewed, however, as the team did not know how to approach what Konami wanted, and members of the team, wanting to work on ideas they never got the chance to develop, intended to leave Konami. The decision would come, however, to change the game's focus from one of campy, silly horror to exploiting the fear of the unknown. As a result, the game took on much more of a psychological turn, making the player fear what was around the corner more so than what was on screen at that moment. This change in direction would prove to be what sticks out so vividly in the minds of those who played it. Along with the numerous development tales that I could talk about because it's a story in and of itself, I'll splice a few bits here and there when I see it as appropriate. For now, however, let's talk about the game, or more specifically its packaging. First of all, let's discuss the covers of the international releases. Europe's cover is dark, dirty, makes great use of contrast to give the potential buyer an idea of what they're in for, and is all in all probably the best cover available for this game. The American release of the game would have a front cover that is classic American cover art in all the wrong ways. The clever use of contrast in the European cover is out to lunch here. There's no obvious focal point, the typography doesn't work nearly as well, and in all, it's just a pretty poor cover. The Japanese cover is much more simple compared to the other two. Rather than the horrifically grimy looking European cover, or the simply horrific American cover, Japan's cover consists of blood-stained walls with the game's name written towards the right side of the cover in an unusually small manner. It's not nearly as bad, messy or directionless as the American cover, but the small name on the right doesn't do much for me. They could have easily taken the same approach they took on the European cover. The bloodstain on the wall is also most obviously the game's name, but bloody. I respect the idea of a tiled wall as the backdrop, and the Japanese covers of the Silent Hill games tend to focus on having covers based on a location or a concept more than anything else, but I'm not sure I'm sold on this cover. Anyway, let's head to the back cover to see a lot of text. Time to break out the translator again in a second because there's just so much text here that it doesn't leave much space for the 8 screenshots they use for this game. Genuinely though, the screenshots are way too small to be able to make out any details in them. Arguably it's for the better because horror is best served obscure and indefinable, but by that point, why have the screenshots there in the first place? Let's look inside the case where we have the manual and the CD. Behind the CD, however, is some artwork of the character Alessa Gillespie, illustrated by artist Trevor Brown. I would show some more of his work here, but I like having my YouTube channel not being thrown in the bin for showing his stuff. And not because of copyright either. So instead, let's scan through the manual. It's a relatively short manual with not much of anything in it. It has the critical stuff telling you the features of the game and how you interact with them, but there's so little in this manual that I can't help but wonder if it could have either been expanded on or compressed further. As it is, however, we have a lot of dead space in the manual that could probably have been used more effectively or even not be printed. It is what it is though, and it's far from bad in terms of its presentation. For now though, I think we should pop this game into the PS1 and get going. Our game starts up with an FMV sequence consisting of story events and cutscenes shown out of order, with the end of it showing us how we reached the start of the game. I should stress that this review will go through the entirety of the game's story. This is probably the most narrative focused game I have reviewed so far, so I'm going to put up a big old spoiler alert warning right now. As with the other games I've reviewed that have stories, I'll be going over the story events in detail, and given how the narrative is quite a focal point in this game, if you're interested in experiencing it for the first time yourself, well, you know what to do. Or not do, as the case may be. After selecting a difficulty, another cutscene plays, this time of us climbing out of our total car, only to realise that our daughter, Cheryl, is missing. We walk into the town before seeing a figure that looks like Cheryl walk towards an alleyway. We go through a gate to see a horrifically mangled creature, before we go along a very narrow and claustrophobic path where camera angles are your enemy. At the end of this, you encounter yet another gate and proceed through it. All of a sudden, the entire environment goes dark, leaving you with just a cigarette lighter to enable you to see, if only slightly. A wheelchair with a creaky wheel and an occupied gurney are followed very soon by the walls and floors becoming sanguine and rusted. At the end of this bloodied trail are corpses, one of them hanging with arms splayed and chained to the fence. Moments later, we are accosted by a few creatures who latch onto us before we collapse and die. Except those last two words aren't quite accurate, and reports of our death have, in fact, been grossly exaggerated. We are brought to a diner where a policewoman, Sybil Bennett, waited for us to wake up. Upon waking up, we talk with Sybil and introduce ourselves as Harry Mason, a man who was taking his daughter Cheryl on holiday to the town of Silent Hill. He asked Sybil if she saw someone who looked like Cheryl, but upon not getting the answer he wanted, he tries to leave. Sybil just about stops him, however. Realising he is unarmed and with no way to protect himself from any horrors out there, Sybil gives him a handgun. A rather bold move for a police officer under any circumstances, but right now, we need anything we can get. Sybil then leaves and we resume control. Within this room, there's a surprising amount that can keep us occupied, and it also serves quite well as a vertical slice of how the game works. In this room, you'll pick up items, check out things like the map, try to interact with different things, and work out how to use your weapons. After picking up a bottle, a knife, a torch, a map, and another bottle, we save our game and prepare to leave. As we reach the door, however, we hear noise coming from a portable radio. We walk towards it and interact with it before suddenly, a creature smashes the nearby window and attacks us. Fending it off, it dawns on us that we're in some twisted nightmare realm with no obvious way out. There is, however, a way out of the diner, and that is the door we attempted, on 2 occasions at this point, to leave through before being interrupted. Now free of said interruptions, we pass on through. Upon leaving the diner, Harry decides it would be best if we return to the place that we collapsed at, to see if there are any clues on Cheryl's whereabouts. So with that in mind, we mark the location on our map, and we head towards it. With that, I think it's best that we go over the controls, now that we're in an environment where we can talk about them. If you're unfamiliar with PlayStation 1 horror games, particularly ones like this and Resident Evil, you might be a little stuck at how this game controls. The game does support analog control with the analog sticks, but I personally didn't use them. They're a little bit awkward for the kind of game it is and wouldn't really be viable as a control method until later games. With that, we'll start with movement. The D-pad controls your character, but rather than being controlled in relation to the camera, like in most 3D platformers, it moves your character in relation to itself. Up on the D-pad will move you forward and down will move you backwards, and left and right will turn you in those directions. Not move, turn. This is what's often referred to as tank controls, and is something of an early horror game staple. Considering the environments and the kind of game it is, it's a control scheme that makes sense even if it can be a little unwieldy. Some might argue though that it's part of the charm, and a part of why it's so good. I can kinda see the point, but unwieldy controls are still unwieldy because we still haven't gotten into the other parts of the controls yet. The shoulder buttons are pretty eclectic in their utility. Let's start with the L1 and R1 buttons, which work as sidestep buttons in the direction you're after. However, if you press both buttons, you'll be able to turn 180 degrees, especially useful to deal with any foes behind you. The other shoulder buttons are a bit more straightforward. L2 activates what the manual refers to as search view, which is basically a way of telling you that you can alter the camera angle just enough to be able to look around you where possible. R2 on the other hand is the button you will use to enable a combat situation, as pressing it will arm you and prepare you to use your weapon. But how would you actually use your weapon? Well, let's go over the face buttons now. To use a weapon, use the R2 button to arm yourself and attack using the circle button. I'll go over the specifics of combat later, but for now, the circle button enables you to use your weapon in conjunction with R2, and circle is also the button to use to interact with things in the world. The X button is your sprint button. Hold it down and you will be able to run whilst moving forward or running sideways when you press the L1 or R1 buttons. Sprinting for long enough, however, will cause Harry to try and catch his breath when you stop, although there isn't really a stamina stat to speak of. Having returned to the place where things went to hell in a handbasket, we see the path is blocked, but there are a few things on the ground: a note, a sketchbook and a pipe. Having noticed the note, we take a note of it notifying us of the school. We then look at the sketchbook, which we're pretty sure is Cheryl's, and we take the pipe for the simple reason that we can use it for melee combat. Having seen everything we need to see, we make our way towards the school, but there is a problem. All the roads leading to the school are mysteriously destroyed. At the end of one of these destroyed roads is yet another note, telling us to go to a particular house on Levin Street, one which has a doghouse outside of it, within it being a key to the house. In the house, we see the back door has 3 locks that require keys for us to unlock them. Next to the door, there is a map which is marked with the locations of the different keys, so we apply them to our map and make our way out. We go towards the locations on the map where the keys are and we find them, before we make our way back to the house with our 3 keys. Going through the door, however, the world around us suddenly turns dark, any light blotted out by some unknowable force. This enables us to make our way towards the school now that we are free of destroyed roads. Finding the school bus, it verifies to us that we are close to the school, and as a result, we walk back up the street slightly as we enter the school. Midwich Elementary School is our first main dungeon, as it were. The game's outdoor exploration is separated by indoor environments that require an amount of riddle solving. Our first port of call, however, is to pick up the map that is at the entrance. Moments later, we go towards the reception to see 3 books with riddles scrawled in blood and in a language approximately 120 million people can understand, and I am not one of them. Yet. Anyway, we now have to do some exploration around this school. Exploring this place allows us to use the map, which is fairly important if you want to be able to remember the layouts of the environments. So let's talk about how the map works within these indoor sections. Provided you have the map for the area, pressing triangle opens up the map to give you your location, and red ink marks showing locations of interest or doors that you've accessed, as marked by arrows, a flat line, or a squiggle. Later on in the game, there will be situations where the map isn't available to you for one reason or another, so don't build up too much of a reliance on it. That said, if you're committed enough, nothing is stopping you from making a pen and paper map if you need one. As we work our way through the school, we amass a collection of different items, varying from ammunition and curatives to key items that will allow us to progress through the game by solving some riddles, a few of which consist of reasonable complexity. Within one of the rooms is a particularly infamous puzzle, one which stumped a good number of players upon encountering it for the first time. In the music room on the upper floor is a riddle scrawled on a score in blood, and the piano has a section of keys stained in crusty red. Naturally, you would press the keys to see what they do, and doing so will reveal many of them making piano-like sounds, whilst other keys will clack in a weirdly mechanical way. Now, if you gave me this riddle in English, I'd be able to tell you the solution, but in Japanese... in fact, I think now would be an excellent time to explain what the problem with this version of the game is. Basically, unless you know Japanese or have played through this game a couple times already, this version of the game may be borderline infuriating. Not necessarily impossible, as the puzzles aren't really designed to completely require you to understand the language, but it's indisputable that it helps. At this particular point in the game, this is where you accept that some of the riddles you're handed are going to be fairly tricky, but compound it with having to solve them in a language you don't understand? Yeah, I'm just glad that I played this game in English a good few times already. Otherwise, the trial and error would have put paid to a sincere attempt at playing through the game, I suspect. Thankfully, as it turns out, the extent to which this game requires you to trial and error your way through the game isn't massive, provided you use your head, and maybe a couple resources. Oh well, at least we made our way past this particular obstacle, and now that both medallions are plugged into the school's clock tower, and we've powered up the generators in the basement, we are able to make passage through the clock tower doors. As we do so, we hear sirens blaring, and the world has a decrepit and rusty appearance to it now. After climbing the ladder and exiting through the door, we discover that we are back in the school? But something's different. For a start, there's a bizarre crest in the centre of the school courtyard, and there's cacophonic piano bashing here as well. Well, there's a good reason for that, and as we enter the school's interior, we discover why. The floor is a rusty grate, the walls trashed and grotty, and from top to bottom, this place's atmosphere is dark, oppressive, and suffocating. Welcome one and all to the Otherworld. No, not the Final Fantasy X song, a place where the most horrifying of nightmares make themselves manifest, and all but the most ardent of souls falter in their attempts to work their way through this inexorable darkness. In other words, it's bloody spooky. Throughout your time exploring this place, you'll discover a few details, such as a few instances where the environment plays tricks on you as you access certain places, such as the toilets in this area. It also helps that in one of these toilets is a rather important thing for us to take, the shotgun. It gives us a new weapon to use against the enemies, but ammo is a bit more scarce than it is for the handgun, as a trade-off for its close range power. The game also uses this building as a brilliant opportunity to show you how this game can be spooky in the many different ways that it wants to. Aside from the unrelentingly dark atmosphere and ambience, the game likes to put the player into seemingly ordinary situations, but creep you out with something unexpected. As a very good example, take the locker room on the second floor. In the normal school, you'll hear something thrashing, seemingly trying to bust out of one of the lockers, and indeed, one of the locker doors looks like it wants to break open. You approach it, try to open it, before a cat blasts the door open and walks out, seemingly being killed by the creatures in the hallway outside it. In the Otherworld school, however, this room is necessary, unlike the normal school, as there is a key inside it. You enter, and again, you hear thrashing in the locker, which so happens to be the same one. This time though, interacting with it will see it open much slower, with its interior imbrued in blood. There's nothing in it though. Was it really necessary to come in here? After all, there's nothing in here. And that's your acme. This entire situation developed over a long time, roughly half an hour or so in game, and it creates this feeling inside that even in Sanctuary, there's nowhere truly safe in this game. There are several moments like this in the game, but for the sake of wanting to keep at least some of the suspense and not wanting to reveal all this game's tricks, I'm going to avoid mentioning all of them and hope that you find them out yourselves. In any event, since we're exploring this place, we find a few practical puzzles which require us to do relatively basic things with the things in our inventory, such as using a rubber ball to block a drain pipe so we can flow water into another pipe with a key in it. There are a fair few of these throughout the game, and whilst the ways in which you use some of these things are rather non-obvious at first, like the rubber ball, once you reach the situation in which it is useful, it will be rather self-explanatory. Towards the end of this part of the game, we read a book in the library which explains something seemingly unimportant. It's basically a children's story about a monster who is impervious to everything soldiers can throw at it. There is one exception, however. One soldier, as the monster opens its mouth, shoots an arrow into its gaping maw and fells the beast with ease. Just seems like a neat little story, but not much more. After fiddling with a couple valves to open the turnstile gate, we find ourselves descending towards a pit of sorts. In the centre of it all is a curious mechanical device with a human figure being immolated, almost as if it were the subject of a sacrificial rite. Behind it, however, is a beast. Larger body, it lumbers towards us and uses its head to attack us. That's not the only thing its head is good for, however, as it can split wide open and consume you, resulting in an immediate game over. The trick here is to fire the shotgun directly into the beast's mouth, like the story we saw moments ago says. A shot or two will be enough to fell the beast quite easily. After killing this creature, sirens blare as the environment around you turns Cimmerian. The figure of a girl appears in front of you and the environment transitions to the boiler room of the school. The girl soon disappears, leaving you perplexed as to what on earth happened just now. On the ground in front of you is a key, and confident there's little more to do here, we made preparations to leave, leading us to take note of the sounds of the bell tolling in the distance. We believe it to be coming from the nearby Balkan Church, so we mark that as our next destination and leave the school. Having completed this section, we are brought back out onto the incredibly foggy streets of Silent Hill. Once again, we are given a destination, and with approximate directions on how to get there, we have some idea of what it is we are supposed to do now. Of course, there is the matter of navigating the town, so let's talk a little bit about it, and what makes this whole deal so effective and scary. This will be the first of the development tales I tell of this game, and it's in regards to why the town of Silent Hill is so incredibly foggy. To start out, let's go over one fundamental problem with the hardware afforded to the game and its developers by the PlayStation. Basically, it's not very powerful. PlayStation games, in fact games of that generation in and of themselves, tended to require relatively low draw distances, meaning fewer parts of the game would be rendered at a time. The way games like Turok Dinosaur Hunter and GoldenEye 007 would work around this issue was by using a thick fog that obscured everything in the distance. This way, the game rather cleverly hides the fact it can't show everything at once. Silent Hill would not only utilise the fog effect as a means of reducing the amount of stress to the hardware, but it would also be worked into the story, as you inhabit an alternate world, something that is already apparent when there are monsters around and seemingly no signs of friendly human life. Similarly, the game makes use of darkness when it needs to in order to turn everything Bible black, with the only weapon cutting through it being your slightly anemic torch. Ultimately, it makes the game look better simply because there isn't all that much for the game to render, but what it does render tends to look relatively good, to say that it's being rendered on the PlayStation 1, but I want to talk about the visuals a little bit later. For now, we have a key, we use it, and we make our way to the source of the bells, the Balkan Church. Standing before the altar is an older woman in seemingly religious garb. This enigmatic woman introduces herself by telling us she was expecting us because of gyromancy. For the uninitiated, gyromancy is, to put it simply, divination via running around in a circle that has the alphabet placed around it, and running around dizzily enables the sentence to be formed in the process. Imagine if you combined a Ouija board with Twister and musical chairs, and you've basically got gyromancy. Anyway, this woman is seemingly aware of our plight, in that we are looking for the girl, but offers little more than vagary. In doing so, she introduces something to us called the Flauros, which basically looks like a Rubik's Cube if it were a tetrahedron and was seemingly made by Noctua. What this Flauros actually does is anyone's guess at this point. However, she also instructs us to go to the hospital, but it isn't on our map. She leaves, and in doing so, leaves many a question unanswered and the Flaros and a key on the altar. The key is made for a bridge control system, so we can defer as a result that our destination is beyond a bridge. It's a straight shot to the bridge and we're able to run right towards it, but we have to lower the bridge by using the control building. Doing this enables us to go to a few different locations, such as an empty police station, consisting of only a few pieces of ammunition and curatives, as well as information on some unscrupulous happenings in and around town. Ultimately, we end up on our way towards the hospital, and dealing with the dogs through the gate, we end up getting down with the sickness. Al Camilla Hospital doesn't seem immediately dangerous with the exception of a gun going off in very close proximity. We're compelled to investigate, and in doing so, discover in a nearby office there really are signs of human life. The only problem is they seem to be particularly on edge and cautious, as proven by the fact that they shot something just now, and they fire a shot at us upon our entry into the room. After reassuring him that we're not hostile, he introduces himself as Dr. Michael Kaufman. Albeit calm sounding, he expresses a lot of confusion towards the situation, puzzled about why the monsters exist the way they do, and trying to make sense of why the town is snowy at this time of year. Things really are perplexing. We try to get information regarding Cheryl's whereabouts, but Kaufman raises some alarms in us, but quickly apologises, and expresses sympathy after asking about our wife, but Harry clarifies she died a few years ago. He prepares to leave, but we don't ask where he's going or what he'll do. What we will do, however, is acquire a map that's useful for the hospital. We start to explore the different parts of the first level of the hospital, going through staff rooms, consultation rooms and a meeting room to eventually find a key to the basement. We find ourselves in the kitchen to see a bunch of plastic bottles, and we decide to take one with us. You never know when you might need hydration or something. In saying that, we also take the health drink with us, which both hydrates us and medicates us. We go into the director's office to discover some shattered glass, presumably a container that once held a curious red liquid. Not sanguine like blood, but something more chemical or medicinal. Since we have an empty bottle, we decide it might be worth scooping up some of it into the bottle, though we don't quite know what it's for yet. We then find ourselves in the basement. It's fairly busy with a few critters and we exterminate them. We find a generator which powers the elevators, enabling us to investigate the other floors in the hospital, which will, without a doubt, be very useful for us. We go to the second floor, but for whatever reason the door is inaccessible to us. As such, we go to the third floor, but we cannot go through. This pretty much means we're stuck. Almost. Because going back to the elevator, we discover there's a fourth floor now. We see a girl walking towards a door in a hellish world, but we don't completely know why. We end up popping out of the elevator to discover we are back in the world of the grisly and decrepit. We eventually make our way downstairs to the third floor, enabling us to get our bearings. When it comes to dealing with the enemies here, which happen to be nurses and doctors, we end up dealing with them in a way that takes greater advantage of what we have in our arsenal. Namely, we bonk them on the head a few times and stamp them. I guess now would be a good time to talk about the combat, because frankly, it isn't exactly great. And I know there will be the odd response of, well, of course the combat isn't amazing, it's supposed to be awkward to give you a feeling of dread, which, I get it. I understand that the game's control is as awkward as it is because it gives the player a sense of a lack of control over the situation, thereby amplifying the tension and overall scariness. But allow me to counter with something rather simple. Say, for the sake of example, you're fighting a couple of those things in the school. Your only realistic option is to shoot at them, because melee combat is, against those things, pretty useless. It doesn't feel awkward so much as it feels really clumsy. Fortunately, you do have other options, such as using ranged attacks with something like the handgun or shotgun. However, since ammunition is relatively uncommon, up until a certain point, you're going to want to be reserved with it very early on. There is another option that makes melee combat a little more viable, namely turn your radio and light off. You can turn the light off with the square button, which darkens the environment and makes it hard to see, but when combined with turning the radio off, it makes it difficult for enemies to notice you in kind. Turning off the radio is a bit more of a process in that you have to go into your inventory every time you want to turn it on or off, which means more time spent in menus doing something that, honestly, could have been better done with other buttons. The start button is the game's pause button, but technically so are triangle and select, as the action is stopped for as long as you are looking at the map or your inventory. Why couldn't start bring up the inventory and select bring the map up? That way you'd be able to turn the radio off as and when appropriate. An argument could be that this makes the game's controls way too user-friendly, and it goes against the ethos of forcing the player to make decisions carefully, to which I retort, it's just a radio. You turn it off in much the same way you turn a torch off. It makes no sense to me that this limitation exists. Anyway, turning off the light and the radio makes it difficult for enemies to know where you are, if you're in the same environment as them. Provided you don't run around like someone with their pants on fire, you should be reasonably safe. The idea here is that this serves as a quasi-stealth system, which encourages the player to use the radio and light as sparingly as you can get away with, since some enemies can see and most can hear sounds like the noise coming from the radio. This comes in especially useful in the hospital, as the nurses are larger in size than the little crotch-gnawing goblin things in the school, and their attacks can be quite dangerous. As such, you'll want to deal with them swiftly and, ideally, quietly. Since we're talking about combat, let's talk about the items we come into possession of that involve combat in some way, starting with the weapons. Firstly, we have the melee weapons, which consist of the knife from the diner, the rusty pipe, and the emergency hammer that we get later on in the hospital. They all have different characteristics which lead to different approaches in combat. The knife has a very short range, but can be wafted around to do at least a little bit of damage in an especially close encounter. The pipe is a little less wieldy, but with that, you can damage enemies a fair bit using it, provided you can keep the attacks going for long enough for it to matter. Now for the firearms. The handgun is the first weapon you are given, and it comes with a decent magazine capacity. There tends to be a fair amount of ammo available for it, so using it for a sizable chunk of the game is viable. It's not too bad a weapon, really. The next firearm is the shotgun, which oddly looks like a sawed-off double-barrel shotgun, yet it holds 6 cartridges. Anyway, it sounds incredibly anemic, but it's reasonably powerful. It felled a beast with a split head in any event. Later on, we'll get another weapon, the hunting rifle. It's the most powerful weapon in the game, combining the handgun's range with the shotgun's power, and uses ammo that is much harder to find than either of the previous 2 weapons. There is also the issue with the curatives in this game. There are 3 kinds which give increasing amounts of health back to the player. Health drinks give approximately 25% of your health back, first aid kits give about 50% back, and ampules totally replenish your health. How do you find out your health? Go into your inventory. Yeah, I know it's more inventory hopping, but personally I don't mind it in this instance. If you're going into your inventory after a battle, it's likely you'll want to heal up anyway, so having your health meter be in the inventory screen makes sense in that way. It also means there's no GUI under normal gameplay circumstances, which is a detail I really like here. It forces you to keep a mental note of your current condition. You'll see your portrait in the corner, and depending on the colour and speed of the scanning of the coloured line, it can mean that your health is good, okay, bad, or near death. You might have noticed that I've barely spoken about the actual stuff we do in the hospital, and to be honest, there's a fairly good reason for it, as it would be a retread of the same sort of gameplay process. Enter building, solve puzzles, get out with a loose lead. So let's go over a few things, such as this curious little puzzle requiring 4 coloured plates with a riddle referring to the colours in order. This is another puzzle that requires you to at least understand something in Japanese, otherwise you are once again SOL. There is also the other parts of the basement level which contain a curious second basement floor, housing a room with the sound of smashing glass, and a sick room with a bed in the middle, and a photo of a girl called Alessa on a bedside cabinet. After turning on the generator, getting the hammer, and getting a key to the examination room, we make our way to it to find yet another example of non-hostile human life, a nurse at the hospital called Lisa Garland. She also has no knowledge of what has happened here, and Harry asking her about Cheryl brings up nothing. Harry then asks her about the basement, where she has no knowledge of what's there. As Harry tries to explain what's down there to her, however, he collapses due to a massive headache. After coming to, the old woman from the church enters, naming herself Dahlia Gillespie. She begins her cryptic ramblings once again, telling us to go to the other church in this town. She also explains what the design on the Otherworld School courtyard is, the Mark of Samael. And much like the questions she raises, getting unanswered, she leaves us. Oh well, it's about time that we left this hospital at any rate. Now that we have a mostly clear destination in mind, we leave the hospital and head towards the antique shop. On the way, we hear this tinny, noisy tone. Perhaps now might be a good excuse to talk about the audio used in this game. The audio was handled primarily by one man, Akira Yamaoka. His previous work consisted of games such as Contra Hardcore, Vandal Hearts, and Ganbare Goemon Uchu Kaizoku Akogingu. He would go on to work on the majority of the Silent Hill series and other games like Cinemora, Killer is Dead, and No More Heroes 2 Desperate Struggle. His musical influences come to the fore here with a clear tinge of Angelo Badalamenti in the tone of the music, but this is mostly just what we would traditionally refer to as music. In reality, there's a lot more dissonance in this music, with the use of heavy industrial sounds that are clearly inspired by Nine Inch Nails. The use of things like dentist drills, metal banging against metal, and other noisy sounds makes for a soundtrack that is incredibly dark, grisly, unique, and superbly horrifying, and it makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand. I love this soundtrack ever so much. How do you know the soundtrack works as well as it does? Because when Yamaoka showed off his work to the team thought the audio equipment was busted, but then Yamaoka explained that it was supposed to sound like that. What was thought to be busted equipment was entirely intentional. Amazing. The sound effects in this game also work very well. With the radio on, when you hear the noise emanating from it, you are immediately on edge, wondering what form the enemy that is near you will take. Or enemies, because, well, it's all bloody spooky. The sounds of the enemies in the distance or even in close proximity are also quite scary. The different kinds of sounds being made by these enemies puts the player on edge. I love the way this game uses sound to keep you on your toes. And even though during the streams I made jokes in the direction of the sounds being used in situations that were made to startle the player, rather than make them anxious, it still worked pretty damn well. As for the voice acting... oh dear.
Were you ringing that bell?
I've been expecting you. It was foretold by gyromancy.
It's fair to say that the voice acting isn't exactly good. In fact, it's actually pretty bad. Granted, it's not quite as bad as House of the Dead 2 or the original Resident Evil, but it's still pretty bad. But in a weird, surreal way, it turns into something great. It seems incredibly awkward, but with characters like Lisa, there are some genuinely excellent performances. Sure, it seems stiff, but like in the David Lynch film, you can make bad acting sound like good acting in a weird way. Even though it sounds pretty stiff and awkward, it's difficult for me to say it's just bad voice acting, because the unusual circumstances and creepy atmosphere somehow enabled the voice acting to sound, on balance, quite solid. It's a bit of a cop-out, I realise, but it's still rather unusual in any respect. Speaking of the awkward voice acting, when we make our way to the antique shop, we see something like a wardrobe stood up against the far wall, and there were also stress marks on the ground. Seems like high time that we pushed it. As we push it, someone enters the shop. Armed with our handgun, we discover it's Sybil, returning to tell us that she was unable to leave Silent Hill to get help from the nearby town she works in. Naturally, Harry tries to get info on Cheryl out of her, but she doesn't have much more news on Cheryl, strictly speaking. Instead, she informs him that she saw a girl walking along Bachman Road despite the road being completely destroyed, as though she was walking on air. Whatever is going on, it's all going to hell in all manner of ways. Harry informs Sybil about Dahlia, explaining her ramblings to Sybil, who ultimately dismisses them as being the thoughts of a drug-addled mind, and explaining that there had been a history of drug trafficking in the town. They then remember there's a hole in the wall next to them, after spending the last minute or so chatting. Harry convinces Sybil to stay back from the wall and goes in alone, to discover the other church in town, as he finds an altar in the back with a couple candles and a brazier on it.
What's this?
Unrelated to that, we also find an axe. We're never going to use it because we have the hammer and the handgun, but hey, an axe. We decide to make haste and return to Sybil, but the brazier starts to light up. Sybil realises something is wrong and runs in to discover Harry has suddenly disappeared. In the interstice, a discussion between Harry and Lisa emerges in the Otherworld hospital. She explains to Harry who Dahlia is, to a degree, a woman whose child had died in a fire and became crazy ever since. She also thinks she understands how the town might be devoured by the darkness, in that the townsfolk were rather religious before Silent Hill became a resort town, particularly stuff involving a cult. It came to a head when the town's development was affected by the deaths of construction workers due to some curse of some description. She wraps up her side of the discussion before we end up waking up in the antique shop, but this time in the Otherworld as evidenced by the rusty ground and the grotty things around the place. We emerge onto the streets and discover that the entire town is just like this. Evidently then, Dahlia's words ring at least somewhat true, even if they're veiled behind multiple layers of mystique and nonsense. We ultimately end up making our way towards the hospital again because there isn't really much more that immediately comes to mind. The problem, however, is that we can't get there by the roads, meaning we have to walk into the Silent Hill town centre. Not a lot in this area, so we decide to go up the stopped escalator. Hold on a moment. The screen's turned on, with a tortured looking Cheryl on them. It has become very much apparent that things are the way they are, purely and simply to screw with us. This is starting to feel increasingly Lynchian, but we decide to go up the escalator in any event. We hear noise coming from the radio, but we don't see anything. We decide to enter a shop, and too well that we did, as we find rifle rounds that, although we have not the weapon for it, we will get it in time. For now, we leave the shop, walk to the end of the walkway to the source of the noise, and the ground gives way. We now have another boss encounter with a caterpillar-like creature. Its pattern is fairly straightforward. After burrowing for a few seconds, it will come out of the ground suddenly, and in the process will spit at the player, and you're left with precious little time to attack until it hides again. We also have access to the hunting rifle now, giving us a pretty potent weapon, but this isn't the ideal environment to use it. Instead, we use the weapons we already had, the handgun and the shotgun, until it is forced to retreat. Now that we can leave through the back of the Silent Hill town centre, we can now make our way through all the rest of what Central Silent Hill has to offer, but our main point of interest is the hospital once again. However, I want to use this dead space to talk about the enemies you encounter in this game. The creators of these monsters were Naoko Sato, and perhaps more notably Masahiro Ito, whose art is heavily inspired by that of Francis Bacon. His work consisted of a lot of body horror in that it showcases exaggerations and distortions of what is already fairly familiar to us, but takes on another form that's more alien and disorienting. A lot of stuff in the game looks distorted yet somehow recognisable, which serves to make many of the encounters all the more horrifying, such as with the creature in the Otherworld school's basement. It's a cool approach to monster design that would be iterated upon in the future, but for now, I like the monster designs in this game. Having made our way back to the hospital, we find Lisa in the examination room again. We ask her how to get to the lake, which involves taking Bachman Road, but since the road is impassable, she suggests that we take another route, the abandoned sewer system under the town. She pleads to us, however, to not leave the room, as she's petrified about what's out there, but also refuses to come with us, suspecting she mustn't leave this place, for whatever reason. After instructing her to wait a little bit more, we decide to leave the hospital again, and there's another change to the environment. This time we're being directed towards a staircase leading up to the roof of the buildings across from the hospital. Moments later, we encounter a gigantic moth monster. Much like the earlier caterpillar enemy we encountered, it has a spitting attack, but it also has a sting in its tail. Literally. This is also a moment where the soundtrack swells and intensifies as the encounter progresses, much like it did at the very start of the game. That said, this encounter isn't massively overwhelming, so we managed to deal with it reasonably quickly. After the big moth decides it needs to go to the eternal lamp in the sky, the world around us reverts to that of the fog world, enabling us to return to our objective of reaching the sewers. Going across the bridge, however, it affords us the convenience of skipping over the tedium of trying to get to the waterworks again, instead simply teleporting us to it after we run over the bridge. The gate to the entrance, however, has a rusty padlock, requiring us to shoot it to gain access. With that, we enter the sewers. The sewer system is relatively straightforward in that we have very few places to actually go, and feeling our way around is generally the best way around, although there are still monsters that lurk within the murky tunnels. Having already spoken about the monster designs in the audio, how about I use the opportunity to talk about the visual side of the game in particular? With that begins yet another development story that I'm sure may interest, possibly infuriate, but also fascinate many of you. The game's 3D work, primarily the CGI FMVs, was handled primarily by Takayoshi Sato, who previously worked at Konami on animation work for the Sega Saturn and PlayStation port of Sexy Parodius, making use of his education in oil painting before making a transition towards working in 3D. Prior to working on the 3D stuff, however, he was assigned rather menial tasks, whilst also teaching people within the development team how to use the 3D software that he had taught himself to use. To bolster his position in the company, he elected to create a simple 4-second CGI animation, as an example of what he could do if given the chance to work on something within the team itself, and threatened the higher-ups that if he wasn't given the opportunity, he would stop teaching his other workers. He finally got a good position in the team to create the CGI cutscenes for the game, but owing to how Japanese companies work, the higher-ups didn't want to give the young whippersnapper Sato the plaudits, and tried to get him a supervisor, despite Sato having completed over a third of all CGI runtime already. Sato fervently disagreed with the proposal, and after arguing with his higher-ups, during which his boss argued he should do the entire game's cutscenes on his own, he ended up creating assets, rigging, lighting, composition, and rendering for every single pre-rendered cutscene in the game. The entire process took, practically, 2.5 years to complete, with the rendering being done on every single computer in the office during off hours, with the side effect that his home had effectively become the office for those 2.5 years. He also handled the character design for the game, which itself came with a challenge. Since this game takes place in America and all of the characters are ostensibly American, Sato would have needed some sort of reference for Caucasian facial structures. However, owing to there being no Caucasian workers in the company at the time, as well as the fact that reference material was hard to get a hold of due to the internet not being quite as resourceful as it is today, Sato struggled to get something to work. Eventually, however, we end up with not just some reasonable character designs, but we also end up with some of the best CGI cutscenes in any game on the PlayStation. Not quite Final Fantasy 8 or 9, but not a million miles away either. The other side of the visuals is what we see in general gameplay. I've already explained why the fog exists and how it is utilised both in-game and in-universe. However, the stuff that we see in the games is also very well handled and only really adds to the scariness. One particularly notable part of this game's visual design is its use of dithering. The game has a very pixelated look to it due to it using dithering as a way of squeezing more detail out of the colour palette. It uses it pretty aggressively and it can look a bit distracting, but it does help somewhat. And one especially massive part of this game's visual direction is the incredible use of camera angles throughout the whole thing. This harkens back to an era where developers limited what you could see and hid little things out of sight until just the right moment. Just the first sequence alone gives you an appreciation for the kinds of crazy stuff the developers were able to pull with the cameras, as not only did they hide quite a lot of things, but they were also very disorienting and provoked a sense of unease in the player very quickly. So incredibly inventive. The animations for the characters and enemies also look a bit odd, however. For the most part they're fine, but Harry in particular has some rather weird animations when it comes to running. That said, you could just argue the stiffness adds to it in a way. What's also not great is how massively variable the frame rate is. Even with the concessions it makes in the name of atmosphere, it can't handle running at 30 frames per second very much at all, often dipping down to, by my estimates, 20 frames per second, and it's not unusual to see it even lower than that. There is one other problem with this game, however, that's difficult for me, at this time at least, to ignore. Playing the game normally, it is in 240p resolution, and it looks pretty solid. The problem comes when you go into the inventory or the map screen. This is one of those PlayStation games that does that silly thing where the resolution changes to 480i whenever you go into something like a menu. It's particularly irritating when that happens here, because it means for me I have a half-second delay before it picks the signal back up, such as the way the OSSC works. I'm hoping there's a way in which I can avoid having to worry about resolution switching in the future, because as much as I love the PS1, this is one aspect of it that I really do not enjoy, and it's a sizable setback as far as this console's greatness is concerned. Anyway, we have a sewer level. As I explained earlier, you just run around and you find your exit in time, but there are a few monsters along the way to make sure you're on your toes. There isn't really a lot to talk about here. It's a fairly linear path to get to the exit. You can find a key or two to get out of it, it's not really anything too noteworthy. With the exception of the chase sequence near the end of it all, we haven't really got much to talk about with this part of the game. It mainly exists as a way of getting us to the next area of Silent Hill. And speaking of which, we finally make our way back out of the sewers and into a part of Silent Hill that has not a massive amount going on. There's a few notable landmarks here, but the most notable thing here is that we have a side quest that is open to us now. We decided it's about time that we had a bit of a rest, so we stopped off at Annie's bar for a drink. What we didn't expect to see was Dr. Kaufman wrestling with one of the monsters near the pool tables. We shoot the monster, allowing the good doctor to get up. Conversation breaks out again, where they explain to one another how nothing is going as expected, with Dr. Kaufman expecting a military rescue squad to arrive anytime soon, which is optimistic, all things considered. He prepares to leave, but before he does, we ask him if he knows a girl called Alessa. A quick, sharp reply comes our way of no before he walks out of the door. We have a look around the bar to see that when he was accosted by that monster, he dropped something which contained a key and a receipt. On the receipt is a 4-digit code that we need to use in order to gain access to another building, the Indian Runner. We enter to find a few things, some rifle ammo, a health drink, a diary with a few things in it, and a note with a few things on it, including a code, but beyond that, there isn't much of anything here that we need to worry about. The code on the note, however, is especially important. We need to use it to get into the motel office. We enter it to find a magnet, and we also have a garage that houses a motorcycle. Inspecting it makes us a little bit suspicious of the fuel cap, which looks like it was removed recently based on the dust around it. We check Dr. Kaufman's key to find that it's for a motel room. We go inside to see a curiously positioned chest of drawers. We push it out of the way to reveal a hole in the floor with a key in it. Using the magnet, we fish the key out from under the floor, which seems to be for the motorcycle. We go back to the motorcycle and open up the fuel cap to discover a bottle filled with a curious red liquid. Come to think of it, didn't we stuff some red guff in our bottle in the hospital? Suddenly, an especially irate Dr. Kaufman barges in, reclaiming the bottle and chastising us for goofing off and doing inconsequential things. Well, mostly inconsequential. The truth of the matter is, we have pissed the good doctor off, and we spent a bunch of time running around a part of Silent Hill with no payoff. Oh well, I suppose it's best if we moved on from here. So let's go straight towards the Wait, the world's changing right before us? Oh, we're back into the other world at the tip of a hat? This signals that we really need to get a move on, so from this point on, we're going to run over to the dock where there is a boat station there. Since this is the other world, the boat naturally looks a bit distorted, but as we enter it we see Sybil once again, and engage her in conversation. She reminds us of the time in the antique shop, but then she asks what is going on and why everything is the way it is. In doing so, Harry explains to her that the town is being invaded by the otherworld, born from someone's demented nightmares. Sybil is quite confused, but really that's to be expected. Harry isn't exactly full of answers with regards to the hows and whys of this town's constant shifting. He's convinced that Cheryl is somewhere in the darkness, but where exactly is another question. Sybil, thinking Harry is exhausted beyond belief, tries to get him to rest a bit, but all of a sudden, Dahlia pokes her nose into the conversation. She talks of evil spreading its wings, but her tone is a combination of trepidation and excitement. She nonetheless instructs us to find the remaining 2 marks of Samael, otherwise everything will be consumed by the darkness. Harry, frustrated, asks Dahlia what to do exactly, and she tells us to stop the demon taking that child's form, presumably a lesser? She tells us to do so in order to prevent Cheryl from becoming a sacrifice by going to the lighthouse and to the amusement park. Sybil decides to go towards the amusement park whilst we aim for the lighthouse. Dahlia reminds us of the Flauros and how it is going to come in useful, but before we can squeeze any more information from her, she decides to leave the boat. With this comes our run towards the lighthouse, and now is probably as good a time as any to talk about something, so how about we talk about the difficulty? Basically, the difficulty curve of this game is a bit weird. It starts out very difficult in that you have to think a few minutes ahead, trying not to use your ammunition and curatives hastily, but by the end of the hospital, you're a walking arsenal. With the number of health drinks you find, you could very well set up a small business, and with how many rounds of ammunition you carry, you would ordinarily be stopped by law enforcement. Something that we don't have to worry about here since the only cop around is Sybil and she's in the same boat here. That said, whilst the amount of ammunition and curatives you have at any one time will sustain a small army, the combat, for the reasons I have already mentioned, remains awkward and tricky to get much enjoyment from, to a point where the game is generally best experienced by minimising the amount of time in combat. And whilst there's a disconnect there are also the puzzles to contend with. Whilst a fair number of them are relatively straightforward, there are the occasional few that are ingrained within riddles, which may require a bit of time to truly piece together. Future games would look at this and implement a few modifications to the riddles, partly to enable people a touch more fine-tuning with how they want to play the games, but the puzzles in this game are, in a way, pretty excellent for the time. I think the legacy of this game for me could well be put that it works a lot better as a puzzle game with awkward combat mechanics, than as an action game whose puzzle mechanics are better than they necessarily ought to be. However, at its core, it's still a horror game. Speaking of horrors, we finish our incredibly long run towards the lighthouse. Once inside, we ascend a long spiralling staircase which wasn't really designed to be easily navigated with these controls, frankly. Another annoyance, but let's not continue with that hatchet. We reach the top of the lighthouse to see the lit mark of Samael, with Alessa stood nearby, but before we could do anything, she disappears. Our only option is to return to the boat to meet back up with Sybil. Except she hasn't returned. We figure the hell with it and make our own way to the amusement park. The road itself is a no-go as it's completely cut off, meaning we will have to once again navigate some sewers. As we prepare to descend the ladder, we see a sequence of Sybil going around the corner, but apparently getting incapacitated with a hit to the back of the head. Harry, none the wiser, continues forth and goes through the sewer system to reach the amusement park. It's somehow a lot more straightforward than the previous sewer level. In fact, this one is almost a complete straight shot. There is, however, a fair gauntlet of enemies, but the pistol, and enough distance between you and the enemy, will usually stand you in good stead. As we progress, however, the backing music becomes increasingly intense, and it reaches a point where even I wanted to get the hell out of there. We finally reach the ladder to the surface and climb up it, finding ourselves in the amusement park. There's no obvious direction around this place, mainly because you don't have a map that would otherwise give you an indication of where to go. As such, we make do with just feeling the place out. In doing so, we find a few of the rides are still operational. Quite how these rides can still be working in the other world is something of a mystery, but at the same time, there are some things better left unchallenged and unanswered. We finally feel our way to find a merry-go-round, but rather strangely, Sybil is there. She seems terribly out of it, however, as she's slumped in a wheelchair. She stirs and gets out of it, however, but all is not well as she takes aim and fires her gun at us. Sybil is very dangerous, as her gun can kill you if your health is not quite full. This is also one of the 2 flag moments of the game. What do I mean by flag? Well, you know how in many games today, your actions, such as those in dialogue or just in general play, can have an effect on the outcome of major situations later down the line? Well, this is one of them, and depending on how we deal with Sybil, we can activate a variation of either the good ending or the bad ending. Why do I say variation? Well, we already had the actual determining factor for which ending we'll get insofar as what the outcome of the game's ending will be. This just adds an extra layer or two to the whole thing, but I'll wait until later to explain. We have Sybil to deal with in the meantime, and as I mentioned, she is not to be trifled with. You can absolutely kill her if you want, and that's kind of the easy way out. Instead, I'm opting to try and splash some cranberry juice over her to see what happens. The problem is I know what it is I have to do, but she doesn't make it at all easy for me, whether she's shooting me or just being a little too far away from me to be able to make use of this bottle. She's always there to make it a little harder than it really ought to be. I died 3 or 4 times trying to do what I was aiming to do, which I'm not sure what I'm supposed to chalk that up to, and the worst kind of failures in doing something are the ones where the reason for the failure is not immediately apparent. Could it have been me making a mistake? Could it have been the awkward controls that only serve to antagonise rather than immerse? Could it have been the OSSE crapping itself whenever a resolution change happened in going between inventory and gameplay? I guess we'll never know. In any event, she gets a nice spritz of the red guff in the bottle. It seems to be doing something as she writhes in pain. A weird parasite comes out of her back and wriggles towards Harry, who proceeds to stomp on it. He rushes to Sybil, who is hurt but alive and talking. The two engage in conversation once more, with Sybil asking why Cheryl got involved in the first place. Harry expands on Cheryl's origins, revealing she isn't Harry's biological daughter, but was instead adopted. Having been found on the side of the road, he and his wife took her under their wings. But Harry's wife's health deteriorated, leaving Harry as the only one to be able to care for her. Ultimately, he determines there is something that connects Cheryl to this town, but what exactly is as yet unknown, and he resolves to save her. He encounters a girl who appears to be Alessa. He requests she lets Cheryl go, but Alessa doesn't seem to agree to that, by pushing Harry away and hiding behind an invisible barrier. Moments later, however, the Flowros appears to activate and a flash of light strikes at Alessa, incapacitating her. Curiously, however, Dahlia shows up, saying all manner of things to Alessa to intimidate her, and making her own daughter scared of her mother. Dahlia forces her into having to do something significant, and the end result, right now, is a massive ball of light engulfing everything, and everyone in the area being seemingly teleported somewhere.
What's going on here?
Once more, we wake up in the Otherworld hospital, but things don't seem quite right here, as evidenced by Lisa appearing somewhat more deranged. A dialogue begins where Harry asks Lisa what happened to Alessa and Dahlia, but Lisa wants to explain something else. She explains she was bothered by something Harry had said, and decided to go down to the basement levels of the hospital. In doing so, she found something within herself, something that had long since been buried within her subconscious. Evidently scared by this, she wants Harry to help her, with Harry trying to reassure her everything is okay, but clearly it wasn't quite what was needed. She storms off from the room and we're left alone in the examination room.
Where do you think you're going?
We leave the room through the door Lisa left through and, oh my, the camera is over the head this time. We walk towards the door and, as it happens, Harry comments that he is being summoned. He enters the elevator as we proceed to wander around in nowhere.
What could be making things like this? I have a feeling if I take the elevator down, I'll find it. Cheryl.
Nowhere is one of the names given to this final part of the game, where you are given no map and you are either reliant on creating your own or just memorising all of the details between floors and rooms. For the most part, however, the rooms share the same interiors as those in the Alchemilla Hospital, but more surreal. There's also a slightly different goal involved, as you are given few directions on where to go, and a lot of the world makes no environmental sense. Most critically, however, is the fact that some of these doors are marked with a symbol and a name. As it happens, the names and symbols correspond to the Olympian spirits in the book The Arbitel of Magic. In fact, that's something I could mention. There are a substantial number of references and homages to different things in this game, from the school being based on the one in Kindergarten Cop, which happens to have Sonic Youth as its teachers, or a doctor being named after the founders of Troma Entertainment. This game wears its influences not just on its sleeves, it has a full-on badge-laden jacket. Anyway, to spare any further discussion on references for the time being, we are in a curious situation, where I'm making my own map for the game. However, I have beaten the game a few times before without ever using one, so you can absolutely get by without one, and it's not massively difficult to do so provided you have certain landmarks to refer to, such as furniture or certain doors in the area. I won't go through the entire process of beating this area because, frankly, it's superfluous to do so, but I am more than happy to go into a few noteworthy details about some of what goes on here, starting with a puzzle that can just about be completed in English! In all seriousness, however, this is a relatively simple puzzle which doesn't have anything particularly noteworthy about it, other than it being available in reasonably legible English. Instead, what's important here is the door that unlocks upon its completion. We enter what appears to be a storage room, similar to the one in the basement levels of the hospital. There isn't anything particularly noteworthy here, but we enter a morgue immediately after that to find the Amulet of Solomon on the far wall. As we leave the morgue, however, we find ourselves meeting Lisa again, but she realises what's going on with her. She realises that she's not even really alive, and that she's effectively a soul trapped in the eternal hell that is the Otherworld, based on the fact that all of her appearances have been on that side. She is pushed to the far wall after getting too close to Harry. Moments later, she begins to bleed massively, forcing Harry to leave the room and hold the door closed so that Lisa cannot give chase. We are given the option to return to the room, where we see a diary cataloguing the various problems she had been dealing with, combined with the realisation of who she really is. We are left with little more to do here, however, so we must move on. After completing a few little puzzles, we make our way to an area similar to the secondary basement of the Alchemilla Hospital, with our first port of call being the room which resembles its kitchen. In the middle is a large fridge with a broken chain hanging on either side of the door. This requires the use of a certain item obtained earlier on to join the chain together after taking the Dagger of Melchior. Why? Well, this is one of the few instances where you can get an instant game over if you don't do it. There's also the small matter of the VHS tape we acquired in the hospital earlier in the game. If we tried to play it originally, it would turn out to be a bit of a waste, as the video was corrupted and had no clear message within it to understand. Here, however, we get the full video of Lisa lamenting and questioning how and why this child is still alive, presumably Alessa. It goes into a little bit of graphic detail about bandages being soaked in blood and pus, as well as her skin being horrifically burnt. We get additional context later on in the sick room from earlier, as we see the apparitions of Dahlia, Dr. Kaufman, and two other doctors discussing Alessa's condition and how they might be able to either use her or heal her, and then use her. With all of these objects we have collected, we have basically everything we need to access the very final part of the game. Opposite the sick room, conveniently, is a bedroom which appears to have belonged to Alessa, scattered with toys, books and drawings. The other door is locked and requires the insertion of 5 different objects, and throughout playing this part of the game, we acquire them and insert them into the door. With that, we unlock the door and go on through. We see a memory being played back to us of Dahlia trying to coerce a young Alessa into being used in a ritual and refusing to do so, showing just how warped a relationship Dahlia had with her daughter. We sense a grave evil awaiting us downstairs, however. Now, we must face it. Sybil appears to have been at the bottom for a little bit, discovering what Dahlia has been cooking up for as long as she had. She tries to shoot Dahlia, but a force field casts the bullet away and Sybil is sent flying herself. Harry then shows up to ask her where Cheryl is, stating that Alessa is, in fact, Cheryl. Harry refuses to believe it for some time, but eventually comes to accept it. Alessa is explained to have been living a 7-year nightmare, and Dahlia had long planned to revive Alessa with Cheryl under one vessel. She begins rambling again about returning to the true paradise and washing away one's sins, but in the end, she begins the ritual to make Alessa the Mother of God. Suddenly, however, Dahlia is shot. Moments later, Dr. Kaufman walks onto the stage, angered over being used for the sake of Dahlia's sick rituals. Dahlia tries to argue back over how his role is complete, but the good doctor has one last trick up his sleeve: the red bottle. Dahlia cries out the contents of the bottle, a Galophatus. Having hidden it away from Dahlia for as long as he had, the time finally came to use it, as Dr. Kaufman throws it in the direction of the incubator. Gown stained in scarlet and writhing in agony, Alessa falls to the ground. The ambience turns hellishly noisy, however, and as Dahlia cackles maniacally, a creature births itself from the back of the incubator and fries Dahlia in the process. We are now left with only one thing to do: destroy the Incubus. Its lightning attack is tremendously damaging, and if our health isn't at 100%, the likelihood is we will die if it hits us. Fortunately for us, however, we have all the restoratives in the world, so that's no issue. Not that I didn't die to it, of course. I try to focus on evasion rather than just taking the easy way out and tanking the damage, which, if you like me and have an absurd number of healing items, you may as well do, as there's no loss to it. The strategy to defeat the Incubus is fairly simple: just shoot at it. Ideally with the shotgun or the hunting rifle, as both will deal high damage to it, but the hunting rifle will be better at slightly longer distances. You can also avoid the lightning strikes, usually by strafe running away from them, but I wasn't quite able to get it right. Once we do enough damage to it though, it collapses to the ground and returns to its incubator form. The environment around us collapses, whilst the incubator hands us a new incarnation of Alessa for us to run out of here with, as the incubator so kindly directs us. Sybil gets to her feet too and follows the light, as does Dr. Kaufman. Dr. Kaufman, however, has an unfortunate fate awaiting him, as Lisa comes up from the ground to hold him and drag him down with her, leaving him to his fate. Harry and Sybil, with Alessa in tow, escape back into the fog world of Silent Hill at long last, before credits. But I'm not quite done explaining this part of the game, as this is where I roll back around on the endings. What you saw was one of the 4 main endings in the game. All 4 are reliant on the 2 flags that I spoke of earlier, those being using the bottle of liquid on Sybil earlier, and also doing the Dr. Kaufman side quest near the end of the game. The ending we got, the Good Plus ending, is contingent on having both of those done. Had we not done the Kaufman side quest, we would get the Bad Plus ending, which leaves us fighting the incubator instead of the Incubus, and Sybil slapping us out of our grief of losing Cheryl and getting us out of there. Doing the Kaufman side quest but killing Sybil will net us the good ending, which results in us battling Incubus and Kaufman meeting his end with Lisa, but Sybil can't attempt to take Dahlia down. We still run out with a new incarnation of Alessa, however. Lastly, at the 4 main endings, there's the bad ending, which is alluded to earlier in the game when Harry claims everything is a nightmare from a car crash, As it happens, in that ending, Harry is shown to have died in the car crash that started the game, all because he killed Sybil and left Dr. Kaufman to die in the bar. There is one last ending, however. It's non-canon, but it's used frequently in the series as a bit of a joke. You need to get something called a channeling stone for this to work, which requires you to play the game in New Game Plus after getting the Good Plus ending and getting it at the convenience store near the start of the game. The UFO ending requires that you use the channeling stone in 5 specific locations in the game, where you'll see lights towards the distance in the starless night sky. Harry will eventually encounter the UFOs at the top of the lighthouse to be greeted with a few aliens. In greeting them, he asks if they had seen his daughter anywhere, probably in a hopeless attempt to try and find Cheryl, but in doing so, he is stunned and brought onto one of the ships. The ships fly away in the distant dark skies, and credits. This, without question, has been the longest review so far. This is actually making me wonder if my process doesn't need adjusting or anything, because there is no earthly reason this review needs to be as long as it is, but here we are. Silent Hill is a game with a legendary status that it mostly warrants. Even almost 22 years on, it has found ways to be incredibly spooky, and I'm very satisfied with playing this again after a little while. It's a pretty good game. It turned technical disadvantages into net positives, and turned aggressive industrial sounds into impeccable horror landscapes, and it was able to do so with some incredibly talented, if mistreated, people at Konami. There were a few negatives along the way, however. Personally, I did not like the controls being as awkward as they were, or being as restrictive as they were, specifically with the way the torch could be turned off on command, but you had to go through a complicated process to do that with the radio. I also really don't like the way people overstate the importance of the controls being awkward. I can understand having limitations, but the game outgrew those limitations to a point where I felt a bit frustrated that I couldn't react quickly enough, and frustration is the worst thing you can feel in a game, as far as I'm concerned. Also, recording this game with the resolution switching was really annoying. It's not great to play with unless you directly plug it into a TV or use an emulator, because if there's one thing the OSSC cannot do, it's resolution switching. It just can't change quickly enough. Those grievances out of the way, I can praise most things about this game. The soundtrack and soundscapes are excellent, the graphics for the PS1 are really good, the CGI cutscenes are excellent, the puzzles are fun to work out, and even though the voice acting is cheesier than a fondue, it was still great to listen to. This is the game that many a retro-style indie horror game strives to feel like. And to their credit, some do succeed to varying degrees, but I've always held the feeling that it takes a lot to beat the original, and in this instance, the original wins out. Silent Hill is a crowning example of horror, and is one of the best examples of what the genre is capable of in a genre sadly dominated by simultaneous underutilization and excessive cliché. My endorsement, however, comes with a massive caveat, and it's tied to the language requirements. The Japanese version of this game has English voiceover, but not all of the dialogue lines are voiced. Some of them are not easily heard, especially towards the end when it gets very noisy indeed, and every other word is in Japanese. Now, if you played Silent Hill before, you can get away with that relatively easily, like I had. I knew roughly what I was expecting with the piano puzzle in particular, but had I not played this game before, I would have been very badly stumped. So essentially, unless you're a massive fan of the Silent Hill franchise already, or if you want to try the Japanese version for curiosity's sake or because you know Japanese, I'm not likely to recommend this version of the game. With that being said, availability for this version of the game is pretty decent. It sold fairly well in Japan, making it relatively easy to get a copy, and their value, although scattered, is not too difficult to afford, all things considered. Prices tend to be around 1500 yen, which is £11 thereabouts, which is not too bad, all things considered. There are two other versions of the PS1 game, however, being the Konami The Best release, which was Konami's budget-oriented line of discounted releases of games, and there's also the PS1 Bucks release, which has a super slim case. All in all, availability is not too shabby, and if you want a copy, go right ahead. Just be aware that unless you know Silent Hill reasonably well, or you already know Japanese, or are just curious, you're probably going to have a time of it. There was another version of this game, however. Sort of. Play novel Silent Hill released exclusively in Japan for the Game Boy Advance, and you're probably wondering how it has anything to do with Silent Hill and how it was put onto a Game Boy Advance. In essence, it's a very heavily simplified version of Silent Hill, taking out the core gameplay and replacing it with a slightly more straightforward visual novel approach. The game is pretty difficult to get, and the game is fairly expensive as a result. The cartridge alone can be 1500 yen, so £11, which again isn't too bad, whilst a complete in-box copy can exceed 15,000 yen. I even saw listings on Yahoo Auctions for 35,000 yen. The game was even adapted to a live-action movie, featuring actors such as Radha Mitchell and Sean Bean. Releasing in 2006, the film was received reasonably well. It has its critics, but the consensus seems to be that the adaptation was at least somewhat faithful to the original game, despite some liberties. And lastly, there was a reimagining of the original Silent Hill, which was released in 2009 for the Nintendo Wii and a year later for the PlayStation 2. Silent Hill Shattered Memories would be one of the more divisive games in the franchise, and it wasn't really intended to be a Silent Hill reimagining, but ultimately turned into one and probably ended up the worse for it. A franchise spawned from this game as well, but I want to talk about those games another time, specifically the three games immediately following this one, basically Silent Hill 2, Silent Hill 3, and Silent Hill 4 The Run, as these were all developed by Team Silent and are the core games of the franchise. I'm likely going to talk about the other games when I review Silent Hill 4 The Run, mainly because that's the last one to be developed by Team Silent before being shipped off to various Western developers over the years. Speaking of Team Silent, it's rather difficult to refer to Team Silent as a consistent entity. If you're a fan of King Crimson, for example, you'll know that they pretty much never have the same lineup for multiple albums, except for the 80s albums. Different members of Team Silent came and went to do other things. This was the only game in the series to be developed by Keiichiro Toyama, Naoko Sato, and Isao Takahashi, who splintered off to form their own studio for Sony Computer Entertainment called Project Siren. Project Siren would go on to develop games for Sony for the PlayStation 2 onwards, with games like the Siren series and more recently the Gravity Rush series. Check the latter out, it's actually quite underappreciated, I think. The next game in the series would be Silent Hill 2, and they would be able to learn a few lessons from this game and implement a few changes to the development process now that they've been able to prove to Konami that they are a capable force as a development team. But that's for another time. I don't quite want to talk about Silent Hill 2 just yet, because it deserves its own video and it'll most likely be feature length like this one. I think it's time that I wrap this up. This has been excessive almost. Silent Hill is a masterwork of late 90s horror gaming, and it shows you how much you can do with so little. Just as much as it was influenced by many great works, it will go on to influence many other things, and in doing so, proves how much of a genuine force it is in horror. If you have any idea of what I should cover in the future, please let me know down below, and my VG Collect list and Twitter profile are in the description. As ever though, this has been Daniel Learmouth. Sidi.